I'm Bob Preising. I flew on the B-36s 1952 through 1954. And this plane is the last B-36 built, and it was the last one to fly. And it was originally built as a featherweight, which means it has no guns except the tail. Most of the 36s had 16 20-millimeter cannons. They found out the retractable turrets didn't work that great, so they took them off, made them go faster and higher, carry a heavier load.
Now, was this a featherweight too? Wasn't there a featherweight and a featherweight too?
The original, the RBs, they featherweighted. They didn't take all the guns off, only some of them. And that's when they mounted they had what they called heavy bombardment, where they converted the ECM bay into a gigantic bomb bay to carry the hydrogen bomb, 42,000-pound hydrogen bomb. But they still kept some of the turrets, so it wasn't a complete featherweight.
Okay.
This was the complete featherweight. I don't know what the designation was. But
well, in the Magnesium Overcast book, they describe it as a featherweight and featherweight 2 program. So,
right.
But this one is fully featherweighted.
Fully featherweighted, yes. Carried a minimum crew. When they were fully featherweighted when they built them, they built bigger gas tanks. So they could put, I think, 3,000 gallons more gas. The regular one was 30,000. The featherweights, I think, were 33,000. So they could go further. They also, I had a friend that was head of the instrument department at Fairchild, and he flew on this particular plane up there, because it was delivered to Fairchild. They wanted him to go up. They were going to do some high altitude flying. He said it was during the daytime and they passed through daylight into night. That occurs at 63,000 feet. So this could get over 63,000 feet with the propellers. This is amazing.
It is. So you never flew on this particular aircraft yourself?
No, I didn't. I flew on Recon, RBs.
Okay.
I was stationed at Travis for about 2 years and Fairchild for about 14 months flying RBs. 4 bomb bays, 2 sets of bomb bay doors, 2 forward and 2 in the aft. The Recon had 2 bomb bays. The forward bomb bay and the Recon was a motor compartment with about 11 cameras, and the aft compartment, 4th bomb bay, was an ECM bay, electronic countermeasures. But this had the full 4 bomb bays, could carry 2 A-bombs. And they had this plane has 2 A-bomb racks in it right now. Unfortunately, the doors are bolted shut and you can't see them.
Well, why don't you explain your personal involvement with this aircraft as it's located here?
Yeah. We heard through our B-36 forum group that the Convair Museum was going to acquire this B-36, which had been at Fort Worth for about 30 years. And Fort Worth could never gather the resources or get together to complete it and have a museum. So Pima said, we would like to have that B-36. So the Air Force gave it to Pima. And of course, Fort Worth was livid over that. I was asked to speak at a final reunion of the 7th Air Force to explain to them what their 36 looked like once it got to Pima and got finished. Half the people thought it was great, half the people wanted to throw tomatoes at me for taking an airplane. But anyway, we came down here and told people that we flew on these, and the director of the museum called us into his office and said, the B-36 nose is going to arrive this coming Friday. If you guys, or next Friday, I said, come down on Friday morning before 10 o'clock and come into my office, and then plan on staying overnight because they're going to have a dedication by the mayor of Tucson. So we came down and he gave us this special pass here, my buddy and I. This allowed us to get anywhere in the museum. And so anyway, we came out and the nose arrived, but it arrived late. They had to block off roads and had to go through, I don't know, get off the road and go through Fort Huachuca almost, because they couldn't go under the freeways. And they couldn't use the freeways during 5 o'clock rush hour traffic. So it arrived about 6:30 Friday evening, and they had the news media here, and my buddy and I both were on the local news media about the B-36. The following morning, the mayor was there and welcomed him. Somebody raised their hand and asked the director, I hope you've got somebody here that's going to take pictures of the restoration. He says, yeah, I have 2 photographers right here that both flew on them. So now we knew what our job was, to photograph the restoration. So I made 80 trips down here in the 4 years that it took to rebuild this plane.
Now, you've told me before, but for the video, what was the estimated initial restoration time?
Oh, the original estimate was, it was like 6 months. And, you know, somebody said, well, when are you going to have this ready? And this was, I forget what month. But anyway, they said, oh, shortly after the first year. And everyone involved just says, no way. And it was just about 4 years. And in fact, they didn't even complete it in restoration. They moved it out here before they put on the jet pods and the outside propellers, because they would have had to move more airplanes to move it out. Mm-hmm. So they completed it out here, so a little over 4 years. But I came down on many occasions because they had parts they didn't know what they were or where they went. And my buddy and I, we either recognized it or we knew people that could tell us. So it was interesting because it came down and, you know, 20 truckloads.
Who disassembled the airplane?
The guys from here went down and helped disassemble it. But, you know, nobody really marked it or numbered it or what have you. And there are a few parts that they weren't quite sure where they came from.
Okay. So some of these things would be obvious to some people, but just for the sake of the video, could you tell us some things like what the dome is on the bottom, the bubble on the top, the round hatch on the side, and so forth?
Okay, yeah. This is the radar, used for radar bombing and also navigation. This plane, really, it was built as a featherweight and should not have had that upper blister. But when it was at Fort Worth, they wanted to have this a museum, so they wanted the light. So when people climbed on board, they could see, so they put blisters on it.
So it was not manufactured with that, it was added after?
Right, the blisters were on the ones that had the guns.
Okay.
But the featherweights didn't have the blisters.
Okay.
Some of them had lower blisters in the rear for the scanners to see, and some of them didn't.
So this was not, the configuration is not as it was manufactured?
No, it's been changed a little bit.
Okay.
This hatch here is where the front crew members got in and out, and then this is how they bailed out. This hatch right here.
That seems like it would be really tricky to bail out of that.
The whole secret is you stand and you roll.
Okay.
In order to bail out, we had to feather number 3 engine, otherwise they'll get chopped apart. And to load, they used to have put a crew chief stand, so they'd climb up and down, or you could also go in through the nose wheel. When the nose wheel door was down, there's a ladder that pulled down and you climb up.
Okay.
And that's how we got in it when I was out here in restoration.
So for emergency egress on the ground, how would you get out? Because I know in the C-97 they had a rope that they would throw out and supposedly climb down the rope.
I don't know if they had the rope. I didn't fly in the forward compartment. I flew in the aft compartment.
Okay.
And we had a ladder we dropped down, so we just climbed down the ladder.
Okay.
But in front here, because it would take a while to climb down the ladder out the wheel well. But you know, in those cases, maybe they'd open the hatch and just jump. I don't know. When they first built it, had a single wheel, about 9-10 feet in diameter. And the first couple times they landed on runways, they tore the runways up. So when they said, fix the gear. So this is the first truck landing gear ever built for an airplane. So they could have 4 wheels to spread the weight around a little bit. As a gunner in the aft compartment, my job was to climb up. On this knuckle right up there, we had a lock. We had to pull the lock out so we could retract the gear.
You talking about the knuckle on the end of this short arm?
Straight up.
Oh, the one.
See where the C-clamp is on? We have a C-clamp
okay,
on
I
there
see.
instead of a down lock. I guess they don't have a down lock.
Yeah.
But we had to climb up there. Luckily, I was young and in good physical condition. But we had to climb up there, pull it, and then after we landed, we had to climb up there and reinsert it. And when you do that in the snow, that is tricky. I was a squadron standboard crew, and one time we were taking a crew up, and I was riding standboard with the guys in the back, and I explained to both lowered scanners, I said, I want you to go up there, pull that down lock off, and climb down. And I only watched the one guy, I didn't watch the other guy. Well, I guess the other guy couldn't climb up the gear and didn't pull the lock and didn't tell me. We took off and the landing gear wouldn't raise. And I looked out and I said, the gear lock is still in place. Our aircraft commander, who was flying to help with the pilot, said, Preising, that's your responsibility. Go pull that down lock. So I had to climb out in the wing and climb down and reach down and pull the down lock.
In flight?
In flight. And you couldn't wear a parachute when you climbed into the bomb bay or wing.
So you can get out into this through?
Yes. They are. Right up here, there's a hatch, a ladder that goes down in the hatch and you climb up. There's a catwalk that goes over the top of the gear. And that's how we would get out to the engines if we had to with the gear retracting. And if we had to manually drop the gear, which I did one time, you can see a hook hanging.
Yeah, it's like cables.
Right. We'd hook it on to the spot where the down lock was. And we had a crank up there and you sit and crank it. What you do is crank it up about an inch or 2 inches. That would break the lock and the weight of the gear would drop it. And then the secondary thing, if it didn't lock, we were supposed to get out here and jump on the strut and make it lock.
Oh, man.
But it did lock, so I didn't have to do that. But that was an experience too. Climbing
Not for the faint of heart.
right. Well, you know, I was young. I started flying at 21, so young and foolish. I was probably the youngest guy in the crew, and I was probably in good physical condition as anyone, so they had me do everything.
And you're bulletproof at that
That's
age,
right.
too.
And you know, at that age, I felt confident. I felt I could handle it and do it. I did it. You know. One time a buddy of mine, he was one of the lower gunners and I was the other lower gunner. And the right lower gunner was supposed to climb in the bomb bay, check for fumes after takeoff, but before we pressurized to make sure there was no problem in the bomb bay, and then come back in and report everything's fine. And then when we landed, we'd climb in the bomb bay also after we depressurized, make sure there was nothing going on, it was safe to land. We took off, my buddy was in the right scanner, then I was left. There was a fire in the bomb bay, and he got freaked out. He came in and said, "Oh my God, we got a fire, we got a fire." Well, another guy got our knife, grabbed fire extinguishers, and we went in the bomb bay and put the fire out. You have a fire on an airplane, you got 30,000 gallons of fuel. You don't mess around.
Yeah. So what started the fire?
Actually, it was a hydraulic leak, and it was just, but it could have gotten worse. That's the problem. A little fire could get huge. I was coming in for a landing.
There's no such thing as a minor fire on an aircraft.
On an airplane, no. Well, one time as we were landing at Fairchild in the snow, we were flown up from Travis. We had steel-studded tires, and it was snowing, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning and 1 o'clock in the morning. We were over Mount Spokane coming in for the pattern, and I noticed fluid on my blister, my lower blister. So I reported the fluid, and I said, "Oh, it's probably hydraulic fluid, don't worry about it." And I said, "It's too thin." Well, when we got down to the point where they depressurized and I climbed in, we had about 2,000 gallons of fuel sloshing around the bomb bay.
Oh my gosh.
We had a major fuel leak, break, fuel line break. And so we debated, should we open the bomb bay doors and dump it? And they said, no, it's safer to leave the fuel in. The fumes are more explosive. Then we said steel-studded tires. If we landed on the runway, it was sparks would blow us up. We couldn't reverse our props because it would blow the exhaust into the bomb bay and level blow us up. So we called into the airport, and they said, we haven't cleared the short north-south runway, about 2 feet of snow on the ground. So they brought trucks and ambulances and fire trucks and lined the runway, and we came in. And about the time we touched down in the aft compartment, we lowered the ladder, and all of us jumped out of the plane before it stopped.
So you were landing on a snow-covered runway.
Snow-covered, about 2 feet. So we didn't have to put brakes, didn't have to reverse props. The snow just stopped us. So we were lucky they hadn't plowed that runway, because I don't know what we would have done. Probably bailed out.
So you had winter tires then?
Yeah, they've had studs in the steel, put steel studs in. So, like snow tires used to be.
And could you land on a regular runway?
Yeah, we could, but it would tear the tires up.
Yeah.
They wouldn't do that very often. The B-36s had basically two types of engines. They had the engines with carburetors, which had round-bladed props. The later models from the F, H, and J's had fuel injection, and they had the square-bladed props. And also, you'll notice there's holes in the props here. That was to send heat from the exhaust through the props to keep the props from icing up.
Now, does this aircraft actually have engines installed in it?
No, in fact, when it was in Fort Worth, they actually fired up the engines. They wired for one and instrumented for one, and then they would move the wiring. The Air Force heard they were starting the engines, and they said, "Why are you starting the engines?" They said, "We want to fly it." They said, "No, this airplane will never fly." So the Air Force took the engines. So they didn't realize that it still belonged to the Air Force.
Yeah.
They thought it belonged to the museum, but these are all on loan by the Air Force. This was one of the first, this and then the Nikes, no, not Nikes, Titan missiles. Both had the same warheads, between 19 and 20 megatons. They were the first two weapons that we had to tell the Russians that we would get rid of. So they grounded all the B-36s, chopped them up, and they closed all the Titan missile silos. So that's why this thing would never fly again.
Now, where was your crew position?
Okay, my crew position was back here where that hatch is. We actually had a blister, and they put hatches like this with a little window in them so you could see out. Sometimes the scanners like those, sometimes they like the blisters. I never flew on the featherweight, we had to go to altitude. We always had blisters.
But you always flew on the RBs?
RB, yeah.
So did you ever fly any place that you can't talk about?
I couldn't talk about for 50 years. On one mission in April of '53, we had a 32-hour mission. We took off from Travis. We were heading out over the coast of Oregon and Washington, and we headed up. We just about got to the Aleutian Islands, and they called in and said, we're going to 44,000 feet. We'll be there 7 hours, radio silence. Well, I had flown up to Alaska many times, and I saw the Bering Strait from the Alaska side. I saw the Bering Strait from the other side this time. We were about 200 miles into Russia. We took pictures of airfields, and then we turned around and came back down over Alaska and dropped our film cameras, the film from the cameras off at Offutt, Nebraska, and then flew home. So it was a 32-hour mission, long mission. We weren't supposed to talk about where we went or what we saw. We were never told where we went, but I knew where we were because I recognized it. But I was back at the SAC Air Museum a couple of years ago, and they have a whole section on overflights. The United States had taken pictures of every airfield in Russia and Red China when we said we never did it. But you better know where your enemy is, so you can nail him.
So, did the Russians know you were there?
They may have, but they couldn't do anything about it. The MiG-15 had a service altitude of about 38,000 feet. They could get to 40 maybe, but by the time they knew we were anywhere nearby, they didn't have enough fuel to get to us. And they didn't have missiles at the time. So we felt very comfortable as long as the airplane didn't develop problems and we had to come down.
So were any B-36s lost over Russia?
No. We lucked out there.
I know some other aircraft were lost over Russia besides the U-2 of Powers.
B-47s were shot at, but I don't know if they lost any. Another airplane they used, which I didn't realize, was an F-86. They had stories about that where they modified them, took all the guns and everything out, put a lot of fuel in them and put cameras on them, and they'd go and take pictures of over Russia.
That's new to me.
Yep.
So how high would the B-47s fly on those missions? Do you have any idea?
No, but it was all jets, so it could go higher than us. But I don't know. I didn't know too many people that ever flew B-47s. I knew ground crew members, but I didn't.
Yeah.
But speaking of B-47s, a B-47 flew into Travis one time, and we got home from a mission, and our aircraft commander says, I'm going to fly that plane. And sure enough, he went over and talked to the pilot, and the pilot took him up and let him fly it. And he came back and he said, the B-47 is like flying a fighter. He said, the B-36 is like flying a freight train. You know? But he stayed in B-36s and went to B-52 training. In fact, they went to B-52 training a month after I got discharged. Otherwise, I may have gone into B-52s. The tail turret here was radar controlled. And the early models of the radar had a single antenna where it would sweep and you'd lock on. They soon discovered if two fighters came in, you couldn't see the second one. So the later ones, they had two antennas. This has two antennas. So you could lock onto one and sweep with the second.
So they're side by side in that radome?
Side by side in the radome. When this first arrived, there were two big holes up there. And people asked me, did they have JADO on these?
So how were the controls actuated?
Okay. This huge elevator is actually moved by trim tabs.
Okay, so you
move the trim tab, the wind blows over it, pushes it down. You lower it, the wind comes over, pushes it up.
So, but is it mechanical or is it boosted?
It's loose, that's it. There's no hydraulic, no nothing.
Okay. And the ailerons? The same thing?
I don't know. I don't think so. But I just know that because they had a big windstorm down here about 2 years ago on 4th of July. And that was the last time this airplane ever flew. It lifted off the ground about 8 feet and it came down. And it hit so hard it snapped there's just one solid piece that the elevators are mounted on. It broke it.
Wow.
And they had to machine a new one before they could put it back on.
So when you said earlier this was the last to fly, that's what you're referring to?
No.
That it really was the last one to make an official flight?
Yes. This plane, the last of the B-36s were stationed at El Paso, Biggs Air Force Base. And they were using those last airplanes as ferry flights to carry the H-bombs up to Albuquerque because no other plane could carry them. So they were carrying them up there to decommission them. And then after they finished that, they grounded all the other planes and they flew most of them up here to Davis Mountain. This was the last to fly. What was rather interesting, the aircraft commander on this plane on their last flight was my pilot when I was stationed at Travis.
The one that made the flight over Russia?
Yep. In fact...
And what was his name?
Captain John Winters. Ferdinand John Winters. When we transferred to Spokane, he was transferred to Biggs as an aircraft commander, and he asked me to go with him as his chief gunner. And my aircraft commander says, "Can't let you go, Bob, you're too valuable." Well, I could have made staff sergeant when I transferred, and about a year later I finally made staff. But anyway, I found out that actually it was Captain Winters, he made major, and then he had spot promotion, he was a lieutenant colonel. Then when they canceled the program and they all lost their spots, he went back to major and retired as a major. And when they were redoing the B-36 here, he was in a rest home in Kansas. And he died, he was 90-some years old. And somebody told me where he was and his telephone number, what I want to call him. I thought I hadn't seen them for 60 years. I don't know if I want to call them or not.
So are any of your other old crew members still surviving?
I don't know because we don't keep in contact. I did see two of my crew members on a video of a reunion they had at Merced up at Castle Air Force Museum about 2000. And two of my crew members, our radio operator and our second photo, were there and they were interviewed. I didn't know anything about the reunion, otherwise I would have gone.
So do you remember any of the other crew members' names?
Oh yeah. Our aircraft commander was George Zukowski. Our pilot was Ferdinand John Winters. Our first navigator was Major Fry. So then we got a Lieutenant Jones as our navigator. Our photo navigator was Captain Glasner. Our radar navigator was Captain Yeskovich. Our first engineer was Lieutenant Tex Rankin. Our weather gunner was George Neary. Our first radio was Joe Domeno. Second radio was Frank Jones. And in the aft compartment there was myself, Harold Allen, the other lower gunner. He and I were roommates. And then the tail gunner was Gene Weddle and Norman Rowe, and something McElroy was the upper gunners.
What was his first name?
I don't remember right now. I have it written down. But,
Sure.
but we in effect had two crews, which is too bad. Our crew had flown in combat over in Korea and came back, and so they became B-36 crews, so they had to add more people because they didn't have enough gunners.
They had flown in combat in what aircraft?
And B-29.
B-29s.
I was at Travis when they started bringing B-29s back. So we had a wing of B-29s and a wing of RB-36s. The RB-36s we had at Travis were the first ones that were modified down at San Diego. They had the early A and B models, which didn't have radar. They had roller Bombay doors. They had all kinds of other problems, other things. And they modified all the A's and B's in San Diego and made them RBs. And they called them E's, Model E. And the next production was the D model, so the E's were built like a D. So they were basically the same airplane, except much older and modified. So, but Travis was the first place they were brought into. So we got the first group of 36s up there.
And how long did you fly them?
I flew for 3 years. I put in about 1,200 hours in the air, and I had 80 takeoffs and 80 landings, luckily. So, and I have my flight records, which is rather interesting. It never tells if we went anywhere, it just says the number of hours and the model of airplane.
It's your Form 5?
I guess. But it's rather interesting. The first year is handwritten with a pencil. The next year or two are handwritten with ink. And the last year was finally typed. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
But you didn't handwrite that. That was that was their official records that were handwritten.
The official record, yes.
Interesting.
And they gave that to me when I got discharged.
So you didn't have that contemporaneously. It was only after you were done flying that they gave you that.
Yep. And that's when I found out my first mission was my second longest. 26 hours and 40 minutes. And, you know, after never having flown before, I thought, what did I get myself into? 26 hours. But most of the missions were scheduled to be about 25 hours because that's about what it would have taken us to fly to our target. The B-36s and all the planes in those days had a pre-assigned target, and our strike crew members were briefed every morning on weather conditions to and from target and over target if they had it. So if we ever had to go to war, we didn't have to go to briefing. We just load up and go. And they knew where it was. We didn't. We just knew it was about 25 hours of flying up and back. So I'm sure we were probably located in Eastern Russia. I later saw a plan after 50 years. It was allowed. I got a copy of it. It's LeMay's plans of bombing Russia and what airplanes and where they take off from, the two bases that I was stationed at, Travis and Fairchild, we would have flown to Fairbanks, Alaska, loaded up, flown to our targets, and returned to Fairbanks, and then back to Travis. Some of the others had to go up over the top or go to Thule, Greenland, and then on to Great Britain, and then over. And a lot of their landing spots were in the desert of Iran. In those days, Iran was a friendly country. Right. But landing on dirt on a B-36, I don't know. I'd hate to do that.
Well, that would have been the final mission in any case.
It would have been, yes. Because they had no way of getting them out.
Yeah.
Although I did have a friend that was coming back from Guam, and they had problems, the engine's feathered or something, I don't know. And they were using a little more gas than they anticipated. He was flying out of Biggs. And they got to Southern California, and they debated about stopping in March, and they said, no, let's go on to Luke or Davis Mountain if we can't make it to Biggs. They hit very heavy winds over the mountains of Southern California and ran low on fuel. They landed at Blythe, Arizona, or Blythe, California. Yeah, Blythe, California. It's a very short runway. They landed this huge 36. They needed fuel, so they said, well, you got to shut your engines off because we can't fuel with the engines running. And they said, bring out your procedure. It says you can't have an engine running within 100 feet of where they fuel. They said, well, we'll shut off one set of engines one side, you fuel the other side. We'll start those engines. So anyway, they did refuel. And they wanted to use as much runway as they could, so they backed the plane up, and no one could believe that the B-36 could back up. And they had all the townspeople that were there, and they had them get away from the fence because they backed the B-36 right up to the fence and then took off. That must have been exciting.
Chaff dispensers?
Yeah. We'd load up the chaff in the pressurized area, and they could electronically drop them. And they would blank out to the radar, full of the snow so they couldn't see the airplane.
Yeah.
The plane originally was built without jets. It was modified after the 747 came out, and these are the same jet pods that the B-47 has.
You said 747, you meant the B-47.
Yeah, that airplane next to us. It's the same pods as the inboard. They just didn't put the gear on it.
But, so what's in the bulge underneath in the B-36? Nothing?
Well, right now, nothing. In fact, the planes I flew never had landing lights. I think they were added.
Okay. So they just used the same pod, and they left the bulge. They left the bulge on there that was for the outriggers on the B-47.
And then what they had to do, they had to make one little modification here. They had to make a change here. You can see the 747 is straight. Here they had to make it so it matched the wing, and then drop it down a little bit too. And then this set of jets, in flight we would close the doors so you wouldn't have the air flowing through the jets.
So when did you use the jets? Operationally, which part of the mission?
Mainly takeoff, if we went to altitude, and if we had more than one engine feathered for landing, in case we had to make a go-around. Actually,
if you had more than one engine feathered, let that sink into everyone.
Right. One time when I was at Travis, I was in the left scanner seat, and as we took off, before we got wheels up and flaps up, all three engines on the left side had to be feathered. So we flew with three engines feathered on one side of the wing, and I'm looking out at three feathered engines. That was kind of eerie. We had enough power because the jets were running, luckily, but we had to circle for 7 hours before we were light enough to land. We have no way of dumping fuel.
Do you know if that had ever happened on any other occasion where you had all 3 engines on one side feathered?
I don't know. I never read about it, but I don't know. One of my flights, they had number 4 engine. I was flying in right scanner seat. Number 4 engine caught on fire. And the flames came back and scorched the rudder, or the tail, the horizontal stabilizer. I thought it was going to melt my blister. I jumped out of the seat. I reported flames on number 4, and they said, yeah, we got it. They hit the bromide bottles, put the fire out. So they said, okay, Preising, climb in there and make sure the fire's out. So I had to climb in the bomb bay and climb out to the engine compartment and climb all around the engine, underneath, on top, on both sides, to make sure everything was out. And then we continued and flew 25 hours after an engine fire.
Okay.
This airplane is sitting about 4 feet higher than it normally would. When it was sitting on the runway with engines and fuel, I could walk up to the jet pod and look in the pod. And now it's, 7 feet up.
So that was just the wing flexing down because of the weight of the fuel.
Yeah, and the whole thing was settled down.
Yeah.
We couldn't walk under
Okay.
the fuselage
Okay.
like we can now. It was set low, much lower.
So the struts were compressed and the wings were flexing down
Right,
somewhat.
yeah, a little bit.
Now, as we walked over here, you were talking about the anti-icing and de-icing
Oh, yeah.
systems, so let's revisit that.
Yeah. This had chambers in the leading edge of the wing, and they would pump in heat from the engines into the wing area for anti-icing. Then they had a large funnel going to the tail compartment and went right over our bunks in the aft compartment. And in the bunks in the aft compartment, I was in recon, so we had 3 bunks over the top of the ECM operators. And it was about 90 degrees.
Oh, wait. Keep it on him, not me.
No, we're just documenting what's going on here, so
Keep it on
we got
him.
company.
But anyway, it was so hot on the upper bunks, I very seldom sat up there to sleep. It was too hot, about 90 degrees up there. On the floor, it was about 20 degrees. So if you're sitting in the scanner seat, like I did most of the time, I'd have my jacket off, my flight suit unzipped, and I'd have my jump boots on and my fleece-lined flying boots to keep my feet from freezing. If we set lunches on the floor, they'd be solid. So you could never set your lunch on the floor. You had to set it somewhere. Interesting flying. But anyway, another feature here, these jets were powered in pairs. Both outboards had to work and both inboards had to work so that the plane would... There's a bone of contention about a plane that crashed at Spokane that I saw crash. The plane was practicing aborts on takeoff, and I heard at the time, right after the crash, that one of the pilots, it was a standboard ride, just practicing aborts on takeoff. One of the pilots turned around and told the engineer to reverse props. The other pilot reached up to shut his jet pods off. Nobody was steering the airplane, and it went off the runway. And rather than slamming on the brakes and hitting a parked aircraft, they elected to take off. And they took off down the parking ramp. And I was driving to the mess hall by the parking ramp. And this B-36 comes about about 150 feet from where I was. And he just got airborne and clipped 2 crew chief stands that they had pulled out in the middle, sheared off 2 of his props. The plane crashed and hit the center point refueling depot, which hadn't been used yet. The plane broke, the nose rolled over, and the tail came upside down. And as I say, I was from here to that B-47. It scared the heck out of me. And I slammed on the brakes because I didn't know if there were bombs on board or fuel or what have you. But they said afterwards that the reason it veered off is because they went to shut the jets down, and 2 of them shut down and the other 2 didn't, and steered the plane. Well, there had to be double mechanical problems to do that.
When you say that the outboard jets were controlled in unison and the inboard in unison, were they on one throttle then, or one control?
I don't think so. I think that's just how they work. Because the engineers did not control the jets. The jets were added as an afterthought, and they had a jet panel over the top of the pilots, and so you could see the toggles and the things for the. I'd have to look at one of those and see what it looks like now. Right. We carry, and I don't remember, either 300 or 500 gallons of oil per engine. And these 4360s had, their push rods were external, so you had a cover with a neoprene washer, or rubber in those days. When sitting on the ground is 120 degrees and you go to altitude and it's 50 below, that rubber didn't last. And oil used to just pour out of those rocker arms, those covers. And so if we got down below, I think 100 gallons or 50 gallons, they'd feather the engine. Mainly so that if we needed the engine on landing to make it go around, we could restart. They didn't want to run on dry.
Yeah, and off camera, Bob said that they feathered more engines due to low oil,
Yes.
just to prevent damage than for any other reason.
Yes.
So essentially an endurance limitation.
Yeah. Another thing they were feather engines for is if you had props or spark plugs that didn't work right. And this friend of mine was in charge of the electronics group up at Fairchild. He said he wanted to buy the long life spark plugs like they use in automobiles today that last 100,000 miles. Well, in those days, they probably cost $5. And the El Cheapo you buy at AutoZone was $1. This guy that bought the parts would not buy the expensive ones. And they had, I think it was 90 some hours of maintenance for every flight hour of a B-36. And most of it was changing spark plugs. So they reduced the time, turnaround times when you use the plane again, just by changing spark plugs. It took them years to get around to buying a good plug.
Well, is there anything else that?
Every engine had a electrical panel on the inside the wing, including the jet pod, which is right where the jet pod is anchored. And in flight, you could climb out and reset circuit breakers. A friend of mine was flying to England, and they had a couple engines feathered. They tried to start the jets for landing, and they couldn't start. They determined it was blown circuit breakers. So he climbed out in the wings, reset the circuit breakers, and the jets started. But there was no such thing as maintenance out in the wing. It was strictly resetting circuit breakers. And we could not add oil out there. First of all, you couldn't carry that much oil, and you couldn't move it.
Well, you said there was no maintenance other than landing gear issues, which you already discussed.
Dropping a gear manually or cranking a Bombay doors open or closed manually. We flew up to Alaska one time when we were carrying A-bombs, and we were taking off, and as we started to take off, we had a brand new pilot. He reached over and accidentally hit the bomb bay opened release. and we're taking off. And one of the gunners jumped out of the upstairs, went down and climbed in the bomb bay and was cranking the doors closed as we took off, which is a no-no. But this was one of those big overseas readiness where every plane was measured on everything, including exact takeoff time. And we were measured at, I think, 3-minute intervals in takeoff. We were number 9. We had about 100 B-36s behind us. So if we had stopped to wait for the the bomb bay doors to be closed, it would have been too long. We had vacuum tubes, electronics, so we had to wait for the tubes to warm up. Oh. So it took a long time, but you had a mechanical override in the bomb bay to close them. The radio compartment in the bomber had the forward bomb bay doors, and the aft compartment was inside the bomb bay. And our recon was in the bomb bay. I never mentioned how many B-36s were actually built. There are 385 built. And during that period of time that they flew, we had 22 B-36s that crashed. About half were pilot error, half were mechanical error, and probably half of the mechanical error could have been saved by the pilot if he'd done something different. And the plane never saw combat, but that's still kind of a high number. A lot of it was early learning. The early models with the carburetors, when they'd fly up to the Arctic, the carburetors didn't have any heating, so the carburetors would ice over. And what happens when you have a carburetor ice over on the screen? Gets raw gas, no air, so the engines would catch on fire just from fuel being poured over the top of them. So they had a lot of them crash. They found out later that if they just gone down and let the flames burn out and restarted the engines would have started, but they never tried it. I know of 3 or 4 crashes that occurred that they probably could have saved.
One of the things off camera was that Bob mentioned that his official flight records, which we touched on earlier, didn't include all the flights. So you want to tell me what you told me off camera about that?
Right. My flight records only had the flying time when I would take off and land at my home base. I had about probably 20 or 25 TDYs where we'd fly to other places. Flew down to Fort Worth 4 or 5 times for SAC evaluations. Flew down there to have the airplanes modified. Flew to San Antonio several times for modifications. Flew up to Alaska, Eielson for a few days. None of those were recorded. And I knew which dates I had gone up there, and I looked at my flight records and they weren't recorded. So my flight records really say I had 789 hours, but I calculated the other maybe the 1,200 flights I knew I had.
Well, Bob, thank you very, very much. I've been down here many times looking at this aircraft, speculating about some things, and it's nice to hear things from someone who was there, not only for the B-36 program, but for this B-36 and how it came to be in this place at the museum.
Right, yep. It's an interesting tale.
Thank you, Bob.
I've led a very good life. Interesting.
You have.